06:17 a.m., June 6, 1944. The grey Atlantic churns, cold and indifferent. From a concrete and earth emplacement designated Widerstands Nest 62, the world is a smear of smoke, sea spray, and a noise so profound it has ceased to be sound and is now just a vibration in the bones. 20-year-old Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh, a farmer's son, shivers, but not just from the damp. He is 7 meters from his officer, Lieutenant Bernhard Fröking, who is sealed inside an observation bunker, his eye pressed to the periscope, directing artillery fire from guns miles inland. Severloh is not in a bunker. He is in an open-topped foxhole, a shallow grave scraped from the bluff overlooking the stretch of sand the invaders have codenamed Omaha Beach. In front of him sits his weapon, a Maschinengewehr 42. It is a marvel of pressed steel and brutal efficiency. A gun so fast it doesn't bark, it tears. The Americans who will soon hear it will call it Hitler's buzzsaw. To Severloh, it is his assigned task. But it is also, in a way, a broken thing. The design is so violent, its rate of fire so extreme, 20 rounds per second, that its barrel will not last. It is designed to fail, to overheat, to be swapped out in a frantic, scalding hot procedure. It is a weapon that is, by its very nature, in a constant state of breaking. The naval bombardment lifts, and an eerie silence rushes in to fill the vacuum. It lasts only a moment. Then, through the haze, they appear. Not ships, but a swarm. A dark, bobbing mass of Higgins boats, small steel craft carrying the men of the American 1st Infantry Division. The big red one. They are aimed directly at the valley, the draw that Severloh's gun is positioned to cover. This is the moment the Atlantic Wall was built for. Yet here, at WN 62, the defenses feel thin. A broken line. The men around Severloh are a mix of his own 352nd Infantry Division and the older, less equipped 716th Static Division. They are not elite. They are the men who were left to guard a fortress that was never supposed to be breached. Lieutenant Fröking's voice, tinny over the field telephone, is steady. Wait for them. Wait until they are knee-deep. The first boats grind onto the sand, far below. Ramps crash down. Men pour out, weighed down by gear. Rifles held high, moving through the churning, waist-deep surf. They are 500 yards away. Severloh grips the butterfly trigger. His thumb is white. He is not a killer. He is an orderly, a messenger. He was a frostbite casualty on the Eastern Front, sent to Normandy for a safe posting. But today, he is a machine gunner. Fröking gives the order. Severloh presses the trigger. The MG-42 erupts. The sound is a physical shock, a ripping, inhuman shriek that shreds the air. The first belt of ammunition, 250 rounds, is gone in seconds. He sees the water in front of the lead boat boil, as if struck by a hailstorm. He sees men, figures in olive drab, jerk and fall. They simply disappear into the red-tinged surf. There is no time to think, only to react. An NCO beside him, a veteran whose name he doesn't know, screams at him. "Fire! Fire! Or they will kill you!" Severloh re-aims, traversing the gun in short, controlled bursts, just as he was trained. A burst for the boat. A burst for the men disembarking. A burst for the men struggling in the water. The gun shudders. The barrel shroud smoking almost immediately. The smell of cordite and hot oil fills his nostrils, choking him. This single, flawed, constantly overheating weapon, this broken gun in the hands of a single terrified farmer's son, has just become the focal point of the entire invasion of Omaha Beach. For the next several hours, it will be the only machine gun firing consistently on this sector, and in that time, it will become the deadliest weapon on the beach. The position was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, not a fortress, but something more insidious. A Widerstands nest, a resistance nest. WN 62 was one of 15 such strongpoints scattered along the 6-kilometer crescent of sand that the Allies had dubbed Omaha. But WN 62 was special. It sat on a grassy bluff 50 meters above the tide line, granting it perfect interlocking fields of fire. Its primary purpose was to guard the E1 draw, a small valley that offered one of the only viable exits from the beach for vehicles, leading up to the village of Colleville-sur-Mer. To the men of the 1st Infantry Division, this sector was easy red. To Heinrich Severloh, it was simply his gun's designated killing field. The nest itself was a network of trenches, concrete Tobruk pits, and bunkers. It held two 75mm artillery pieces, though one was a decoy. It had a 50 meters anti-tank gun, two 50-meter mortars, and several other machine guns, including older, water-cooled Polish models. Crucially, Allied intelligence had failed. They expected to face the 716th Static Division, a unit of old men and reluctant conscripts. They had no idea that Rommel, in a last-minute decision, had moved the battle-hardened 302nd Infantry Division to the coast. Heinrich Severloh was part of that division. The men landing on Omaha Beach were not assaulting a soft target. They were walking directly into the teeth of one of the most experienced units in France, occupying the most formidable defensive terrain in Normandy. The weapon in Severloh's hands, the MG-42, was the centerpiece of this defense, but it was a demanding, fragile beast. Its legendary rate of fire, blazing at over 1,200 rounds per minute, was also its greatest flaw. It was a broken design by its very nature. It did not just fire, it consumed. It ate ammunition belts in 12-second bursts, and in doing so, generated catastrophic heat. The barrel, glowing cherry red, would warp and melt if not changed every 250-300 rounds. A machine gun team was supposed to have 4 to 6 spare barrels, and a dedicated assistant gunner whose sole job was to perform the hot swap, a frantic, asbestos-gloved procedure done under fire. This weapon was not a blunt instrument. It was a high-maintenance, high-performance engine of death that required constant, skilled nursing to keep from destroying itself. On this morning, as the first wave of Americans hit the beach, Severloh was being assisted by a sergeant who frantically fed the steel belts into the gun and prepared the spare barrels, screaming encouragement as the air thundered. The gun was a system, and that system was about to be pushed beyond its breaking point. The beach itself was a perfect trap. Unlike the flat sands of Utah or Gold, Omaha was a concave bowl, flanked by sheer bluffs. The tide was rising, fast, squeezing the landing zone into a narrow strip of shingle and wet sand. There was no cover. The naval bombardment, which was supposed to turn these bluffs into a moonscape, had been a dismal failure. Fearing they would hit their own landing craft, the battleships had fired for only 40 minutes, and the heavy bombers, blinded by clouds, had dropped their entire payload miles inland. The German defenses were untouched. The Americans of the 16th Infantry Regiment, part of the legendary Big Red One, were now trapped on this shrinking beach, in plain sight, less than 500 yards from a perfectly sighted, fully operational MG-42. They were caught between the rising tide behind them and the man they would come to call the Beast of Omaha in front of them. For Severloh, the battle was simple. Feed the gun, change the barrel, aim for the ramps. For the Americans struggling in the surf, the plan had ceased to exist. It was not a battle. It was a grinder. The meticulously planned waves of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, had dissolved into a desperate scrum of individuals, pinned behind the steel hedgehog obstacles and the bodies of their comrades. All cohesion was gone, shattered by the noise. Above the roar of the tide and the sporadic crump of mortars, one sound dominated the world. The sound of that one gun. It was a high-velocity, ripping shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a buzzsaw cutting through steel, flesh, and morale. Officers who had survived North Africa and Sicily found themselves frozen, unable to stand, unable to rally their men. Radios were silent, drowned in salt water, or smashed by shrapnel. The problem was simple and absolute. They could not move. Every attempt to cross the 200 yards of open shingle was met by a torrent of 7. 90-mm rounds fired at a velocity and volume they had never before encountered. That single gun, from that single foxhole in WN-62, was holding an entire American invasion force hostage. But in that foxhole, Heinrich Severloh was facing his own crisis. The MG-42 was dying. The barrel, the third one he had used, was glowing a dull, angry red. The air above the receiver shimmered with a heat so intense it distorted his view of the beach. The sergeant who had been feeding him ammunition was now slumped in the corner of the trench, his helmet missing, a dark stain spreading across his tunic. Sevelo was alone. He was trained for this, but the reality was a frantic, clumsy ballet of pain. He grabbed the asbestos mitt. It was already scorched black, and fumbled with the barrel change latch. The hot barrel clattered to the floor of the pit, landing on a bed of spent brass that was already ankle deep. He slammed the new barrel in, but it was not a new barrel. It was just another hot barrel, one that had barely had minutes to cool. It was a temporary fix, a broken solution. The gun was designed for bursts, for a team, for a supply line. It was not designed for one man to fight a war with it for hours on end. The ammunition was the next problem. He had started the day with over 12,000 rounds, packed in metal belts and green ammo cans. Now he was down to his last few cans. The belts, which he had to link together himself, kept snagging. The gun, choked with carbon and overheated, was beginning to stutter. A jam. He cursed, striking the receiver with his gloved hand, clearing the stoppage. He fired again, a shorter burst. The rhythm was breaking. He could see, in the agonizing lulls while he reloaded or let the barrel cool, that the figures on the beach were moving. They were not charging. They were crawling, a slow, agonizing infiltration from one obstacle to the next. The other defensive positions of WN-62 were falling silent. A mortar pit took a direct hit from a destroyer. The 50mm anti-tank gun was silent. He was the last active gunner on the bluff. His broken gun, his dwindling ammunition, and the rising, relentless tide of American soldiers. This was the problem. He was one man, trying to hold back the sea with a bucket that was leaking faster and faster. The tide was turning, not just in the Atlantic, but in the minds of the men huddled at the water's edge. For hours, they had been paralyzed by that one terrible sound. But paralysis is a state that cannot hold. It must resolve into either death or action. On the shingle of Easy Red, a new sound began to cut through the terror. The sound of leadership. Colonel George A. Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, waded ashore into the chaos. He saw the carnage, the burning tanks, the bodies washing in the surf, and the living, frozen behind obstacles, cowering from the buzzsaw on the bluff. His voice, raw and amplified by pure fury, became the new focal point. "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach," he roared. "Those who are already dead, and those who are about to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." It was a jolt, a brutal and necessary spark. The breakthrough was not a machine. It was a decision. This was the moment the broken plan was abandoned. The meticulously drawn maps, the timetables, the assigned sectors, they were all useless, soaked in blood and salt water. The original objective, the E1 draw leading to Colleville, was a death trap, guarded by Sevelo's MG-42. No one was going up that valley. The breakthrough came from improvisation. Small groups of men, led by surviving NCOs and captains, began to see the battlefield for what it was. They saw that WN-62, while deadly, was an island. It was not a continuous line. There were gaps. The real terrain, the folds in the land, the small depressions and re-entrance between the strongpoints offered a sliver of cover. The new plan was simple. Get to the base of the bluff, get wire cutters, and climb. They would not assault the gun. They would bypass it. From his foxhole, Sevelo saw the change. The mass of targets that had been concentrated in the killing zone was dissolving. The men were no longer moving in waves. They were infiltrating, like water seeping into cracks. His gun, so devastating against a frontal assault, could not be in all places at once. He fired, traversed, fired again. He hit men, but for everyone he hit, 3 more seemed to take his place, crawling, using the dead as shields, disappearing into the smoke and the folds of the bluff. His weapon, designed for one purpose, was being outmaneuvered. The broken gun, with its limited field of fire and its need to cool, could not stop this new, ant-like swarm. The Americans had found a vulnerability, not in his gun, but in his position. He was aimed at the beach, but they were now attacking the bluff itself, appearing in places he could not see. The psychological siege was broken. Men from the 1st and 29th Divisions, now intermingled, were reaching the relative safety of the sea wall. Engineers, with grenades and Bangalore torpedoes, began to crawl toward the wire obstacles. The breakthrough was not a single, glorious charge. It was 1,000 tiny, desperate acts of courage. The first Bangalore torpedo detonated with a flat, concussive whoomp that shook the earth in Heinrich Severlow's foxhole. It was not the high-explosive scream of an artillery shell, but a focused, brutalist sound. It was the sound of a door being kicked open. On the beach, the engineers of the 1st Division had done their work. Gaps appeared in the barbed wire. The battle for the beach was over. The battle for the bluff had begun. Small groups of men, fragments of different companies, now surged forward. They were no longer targets in a shooting gallery. They were hunting parties. They moved with a desperate, ragged energy, armed with M1 Garands, bars, and canvas bags heavy with pineapple grenades. They hit the base of the bluff and began to climb, disappearing into the dead ground beneath Severlow's feet, a place his gun could not reach. From his position, the battlefield had vanished. He could hear shouting, in English. He heard the metallic clink of equipment on rock. They were below him. The MG-42, the weapon that had dominated the easy red sector for hours, was now just 25 pounds of useless, overheated steel. Its broken nature was now absolute. It was a long-range weapon, fixed to fire outward, but the battle was now inside his own perimeter. He could not depress the barrel far enough to engage the men who were climbing the cliff face just yards away. He unslung his Carabiner 98K rifle, a Mauser, bolt action, 5 rounds. After the apocalyptic fury of the buzzsaw, it felt like a child's toy. A grenade landed in the trench 10 yards away, exploding with a deafening crack. Smoke and dirt filled the air. The Americans came over the lip of the bluff, not as an army, but as ghosts. They were covered in mud, salt water, and blood. They were grim-faced and silent, their eyes wide. The fight for WN-62 became a series of frantic, personal duels. It was no longer a battle of machines. It was a medieval brawl. Severlow saw an American rise from the smoke, rifle at his hip. He fired his Mauser. The man fell. He worked the bolt, the schlack-schlick sound painfully slow. He fired again. He was no longer a machine gunner. He was just a rifleman, fighting for his life. Around him, the nest was collapsing. He heard a final, garbled shout from the observation bunker. Then silence. Lieutenant Fröking, his officer, was dead, killed by a grenade tossed through the embrasure. The other gunners, the older men of the 7th and 16th, were surrendering or being cut down. The Americans were not stopping. They were methodical. They cleared the trenches with grenades and automatic fire, moving inland, bypassing the very strong point they had just neutralized. Severlow looked at his MG-42, its barrel pointing silently, impotently, out to sea. The ammunition was gone. The barrels were warped. His position was overrun. The sergeant who had helped him was dead. His officer was dead. The gun, which had held the invasion at bay, was broken. And now, so was he. He had fired over 12,000 rounds from the machine gun and another 400 from his rifles. But it was not enough. The sea had breached the wall. He scrambled from his foxhole, grabbing his rifle, and ran, retreating inland toward a fallback position, WN-63. The battle for the bluff was over. The battle for Normandy had just begun. By 3:00 p.m., the nest known as Weiderstand's Nest 62 was silent. The only sound was the wind, the distant surf, and the cries of the wounded, both American and German. The position was a ruin, a chaotic jumble of splintered timber, smoking shell craters, and spent brass. The brass was everywhere, piled in shimmering ankle-deep drifts around the open-topped foxhole where Heinrich Severlow had stood. His MG-42 lay where he had left it, its barrel pointing dumbly at the sky, its metal already cooling, contracting with sharp ticking sounds. It was a burnt-out, broken husk. But the results of its work were etched into the landscape below, a gruesome testament to its hours of fury. The tide was now receding, revealing the full extent of the carnage on easy red and fox green. The sand was not sand. It was a field of debris, wrecked landing craft, and the dark, unmoving shapes of men. The silencing of that single gun had an immediate, profound effect. It was as if a switch had been thrown. The constant, terrifying pressure that had pinned thousands of men to the shingle was gone. The logjam of men and material broke. Medics, who had been cowering behind obstacles, could finally move, crawling toward the wounded. Engineers, no longer under direct precision fire, could methodically clear lanes through the obstacles for the next wave of landing craft. And most importantly, the infantry could move. They began to flood up the bluffs, not just through the gaps they had blown, but up the E1 draw itself, the very valley Severloh had been tasked to defend. With the buzzsaw silent, the valley was no longer a funnel of death, but simply a path. The tactical result was decisive. The Americans had secured their foothold. The Atlantic Wall in this sector had been breached, not by a failure of German engineering, but by the eventual, inevitable failure of a single, overstressed machine and the man operating it. The human cost was staggering. Historians would later debate the exact numbers, but Severloh's position is estimated to have been responsible for over 1,000 American casualties, and perhaps many more. Some estimates claim his gun alone inflicted upwards of 2,000 casualties, killed and wounded. For 9 hours, one man with one broken, constantly overheating machine gun had held back a significant portion of the entire invasion. He had fired 12,000 rounds from the MG-42 and another 400 from his rifles. He had done the impossible. He had made the ocean stand still, if only for a morning. The result was that Omaha Beach became a byword for American sacrifice, the bloodiest of the 5 D-Day beaches, precisely because of the horrific efficiency of this single, well-placed nest. For the Germans, the result was total annihilation. Of the 27 men from the 716th Division and 13 men from Severloh's 352nd Division manning WN-62, almost none remained. They were killed or, like Severloh, eventually captured as they tried to flee inland. The nest had fought to the last man and the last bullet, but its sacrifice only delayed the inevitable by a few agonizing hours. The gun fell silent, but the story was just beginning. Heinrich Severloh was captured later that day, or perhaps the next. The records, like the memory of the battle, are a blur of smoke and trauma. He became one of thousands of German prisoners, his identity lost in the great tide of the Allied advance. He would spend years as a prisoner of war, eventually returning to his quiet family farm in Metzingen, a man trying to forget the sound of the gun, trying to wash the cordite from his hands. But history would not let him forget. For decades, the story of Omaha Beach was one of American heroism, of the Big Red One, of Colonel Taylor's desperate charge. The German side was a faceless, concrete monolith. But slowly, as veterans began to talk, a new, more terrible legend emerged. The story of a single, devastatingly effective machine gunner, a man who, almost single-handedly, had turned the beach into a butcher's yard. They called him the Beast of Omaha. That beast, it turned out, was a 20-year-old farmer who had never wanted to fire a shot. In the 1960s, Severloh's name surfaced. He began to write, not to brag, but to confess. His memoir, WN-62, was an attempt to explain, to lay down the burden of what he had done, to account for the 12,000 rounds and the men who had fallen before them. The broken gun was a metaphor for the man who fired it. He was a simple orderly, forced into the role of a mass killer by circumstance, position, and the brutal efficiency of his weapon. His legacy is one of the most complex of the war, a story that strips away the glory and leaves only the terrible, mechanical reality of combat. He was not a fanatic. He was not a hero. He was an instrument, a cog in a machine, placed in the precise location where he could inflict the maximum possible damage. His story found its most poignant, agonizing postscript decades after the war. He was contacted by an American survivor, a soldier named David Silver, a chaplain's assistant who had landed on that beach and been struck 3 times by machine gun fire. Severloh, haunted, met with him. The two men, now old, stood on the peaceful green grass of the bluff at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking the quiet beach, a place now dominated by the white crosses of the American cemetery. They looked at the ruins of WN-62, and Silva, the man who was almost killed, found it within himself to embrace Severloh, the man who had almost killed him. It was an act of reconciliation that defied comprehension, a legacy of forgiveness that rose from a legacy of slaughter. Today, WN-62 is a scar on the landscape, a few crumbling concrete ruins visited by tourists. But for those who know the story, it is a chilling monument. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes History is not shaped by grand armies or brilliant generals, but by a single flawed machine. A broken gun in the hands of one terrified man in the exact right place at the exact wrong time. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe, because history like this deserves to be remembered.